More people have died in the US in the past 30 years than all combat-related deaths in US history. Yes, that includes World War I, World War II, the American Revolution, the American Civil War, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and so on. So today I'm going to discuss the centrist view of the gun debate. I'll look at the statistics, facts, and arguments from both left and right. I'll do my best to convey these ideas without any biases, and I hope these points are received with an open mind. I won't provide any opinions, just lay down the entire background and leave it to you to make the informed choice. For those of you not aware of the debate around guns in the US, here's a brief overview. People in the left on the US advocate for gun control. They point out that the scale and frequency of these incidents in the US is unparalleled, and a lack of legislation around firearms is to blame. According to them, tighter controls are the only solution. On the other hand, people on the right say guns don't kill people, people kill people. They argue that violent or disturbed individuals are the real problem, and stricter controls on the possession and use of firearms would infringe upon the constitutional right of US citizens to bear arms. Let's begin with some basic stats on who owns guns. Among wealthy nations, US has the highest percentage of firearm ownership. 35% of households and 25% of adults own at least one gun. These numbers have declined in the recent years, but the sales of guns hasn't. That's because owners today are more likely to purchase multiple guns in their lifetimes. In a 2013 survey, 48% of gun owners said that they own a gun for self-protection. People of all ages, genders, and backgrounds own a gun in the US, but the typical owner is a middle-aged man. Someone who has grown up around guns is 3 times more likely to purchase a gun than someone who hasn't. Gun owners are usually upper or middle class, likely because guns are expensive, and guns are more common in rural areas, possibly due to better opportunities for hunting. Next, let's discuss the types of guns these people own. Civilian firearms fall into one of two basic categories: long guns, like rifles and shotguns, and smaller handguns. These days, most guns are repeaters, meaning they don't need to be reloaded after every shot. Long guns are best suited for hunting, while smaller guns are used for self-protection. In cases of criminal misuse, it's been found that smaller guns are more likely to be used than longer guns. Military-grade combat weapons, like those with the capacity to hold larger magazines, are classed assault weapons. In 1994, the Supreme Court passed a partial federal ban on assault weapons. But in 2004, the ban was lifted because it did not receive legislative approval. Now it's up to individual states to regulate the sale and possession of these assault weapons. And so, the ownership of assault weapons varies from state to state. Finally, the most important stat and the cause of the entire debate: firearms account for approximately 30,000 deaths each year in the US. That is the highest for any place on the planet that is not an active war zone. The debate around guns is complex. Some US citizens describe themselves as pro-gun, but make exceptions in some situations. Similarly, some US citizens describe themselves as anti-gun, but find themselves in a similar position. So with the caveat that individual attitudes to gun policy may be far more nuanced, let's get into some of the broad arguments used by each side of the debate. To begin, let's look at the case against tightening the current restrictions. The right to own and operate a firearm is protected in the US Constitution. The Second Amendment states that all citizens have the right to bear arms. There's no additional information on whether or how this right should be regulated. About half of America believes that a strict regulation against firearms goes against this constitutional right. Connected to this right is the claim that everyone is entitled to defend themselves with a firearm. In 2008, in the case of District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment explicitly encompasses the right to bear arms to protect oneself. Gun owners report feeling safer knowing they can protect themselves, their family, and their property. Every year, 1 in every 3,500 gun-owning households uses a gun for this exact purpose. Research shows that in an assault, guns are indeed the most effective form of self-defense, although only marginally. A survey on attack victims found that only 2.4% of the people who defended themselves with a gun got further injuries. This number is 3.6% for people who defended themselves without a gun. Some gun owners believe that neighborhoods with a high number of gun owners are less attractive to criminals. Neighborhoods with high gun ownership, therefore, should be safer. But there's no research to back up this idea. In fact, some research says the opposite. Such neighborhoods are more likely to be targeted by burglars, likely because guns have a high resale value. Some pro-gun advocates argue that carrying a firearm to a public place is an act of civic responsibility. If private citizens can carry a concealed firearm, they are able to intervene in and potentially prevent all kinds of criminal activity. It's been possible to test this to some degree. Many US states eased restrictions on carrying a concealed firearm in the 80s and 90s, and some studies appear to support the claim that it did help reduce the rate of homicide and other crimes. But other researchers haven't been able to replicate these numbers. While some pro-gun advocates believe that there should be tighter restrictions on who can carry guns, organizations like the National Rifle Association adopt a more extreme stance. They say that any tightening of restrictions will lead to a slippery slope of increasing gun control, which will ultimately lead to all private guns being confiscated, and that would be an unconstitutional decision according to them. To fully understand this debate, it's important to note that the US culture connects guns with freedom. Some citizens believe that an armed populace is a crucial element element to any functioning democracy. They say that if the government holds a monopoly on firearms, nobody can hold it to account, even if it is transforming to a totalitarian state. Historically, armed US civilians have stood up to the government. Over 200 years ago, a civilian militia helped overthrow the British rule to gain independence. In a 2013 survey, 44% of Republicans stated that America may need another armed revolution to preserve freedom in the near future. Now, let's look at some of the central arguments for tightening the gun restrictions. The most compelling argument for gun control is the loss of life. Let's look at 1 year as an example. In 2010, there were 31,672 deaths due to guns. Roughly 1/3 were deaths by homicide and 2/3 were deaths by suicide. There were 606 accidental killings, and emergency rooms treated another 73,404 non-fatal injuries. Taking away guns certainly doesn't eliminate harmful, violent or criminal impulses in a society, but it's clear that guns intensify violence. First of all, guns don't require much skill or effort to operate, but they're lethal. Domestic disputes often escalate when someone brings out a gun. Fatalities are 3 times more likely to occur during a hold-up at gunpoint than a hold-up at knife point. Suicide attempts don't often end in a success, but they're 80% more likely when a gun is used. In other words, heated, violent or desperate situations are much more likely to end in death if a gun is involved. On top of that, guns can facilitate violent crimes like robbery or assault without ever being fired. Then there's the form of violent crime pretty much unique to the US, the mass shooting. It's difficult to find statistics on the prevalence of mass shooting in the US because the definition of a mass shooting differs from state to state. Generally speaking, a mass shooting occurs when an attacker uses a gun to shoot more than 3 victims. Between 1980 and 2010, there were anywhere between 18 and 27 mass shootings per year, killing 45 to 122 victims each year. More and more mass shootings are occurring in public places, like schools or religious institutions. Around the year 2000, roughly 1 public mass shooting took place per year. That number climbed to 4 mass shootings per year in the year 2010, and the number has only gone up ever since. Advocates for gun control point out that the lack of a federal ban allows easy access to assault weapons, even in states where they're banned. They also claim that the current licensing regulations and background check procedures do not identify or stop potential mass shooters. Finally, gun control advocates argue that the widespread possession of guns erodes living standards and damages communities. In regions with high rates of gun-related violence, businesses perform poorly and property values have declined. Tax dollars that could be spent on improving local communities are instead used for efforts to curb gun violence and treat casualties. Gun restrictions in the US are shaped by America's federalist system, where power is constitutionally divided between the federal government and state governments. In practice, this means that other than a few countrywide laws, each US state regulates guns differently. At the federal level, minors, convicted felons, and individuals deemed to be a risk are prohibited from purchasing guns. The sale and purchase of machine guns is banned, and civilians aren't allowed to carry a gun on a plane or in federal buildings. Over the past century, Congress has passed several key gun laws. In 1934, the National Firearms Act required fully automatic weapons to be registered and taxed at a higher rate. 4 years later, the Federal Firearms Act required gun dealers to be licensed. The Gun Control Act of 1968 restricted sales of guns across state lines and prohibited felons from purchasing guns. In 1986, the Firearm Owners Protection Act rolled back some of these earlier restrictions, making it easier for guns to be purchased out of state. In 1993, the Brady Handgun Prevention Act required licensed dealers to perform background checks for every gun purchase. In 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which has since expired, banned the sale and manufacture of new assault weapons. In 1996, the Lautenberg Amendment to the Gun Control Act prohibited the sale of guns to individuals convicted of domestic abuse. It is the duty of states to augment federal restrictions. Each state must legislate how gun licenses are issued and renewed, who can obtain a license to carry a concealed gun, how sales of assault weapons are regulated, what background checks should be carried out before someone can buy or sell guns, and what criminal penalties must be given out for misuse of guns. Nearly every US state protects the right to bear arms within the state constitution, and every state permits licensed individuals to carry concealed guns, although the requirements for obtaining such a license vary quite a bit across states. Even after the federal ban on assault weapons expired, 7 US states maintain some form of assault weapon ban. In the wake of the 2012 Sandy Hook shooting, 3 of those states, New York, Maryland, and Connecticut, expanded the range of their bans. Other than committed lobbying groups, public opinion in the US is a broad support for stricter gun laws. 90% of the Americans either support the current laws or think it should be stricter, and 83% support expanded background checks. On the other hand, support for gun rights is rising. In 1993, 34% of surveyed Americans believed that protecting gun owners' rights was more important than gun control. By 2012, that number had jumped to 49%. As of today, 30,000 US citizens lose their lives each year to firearms. This is roughly the same amount of deaths caused by motor vehicle incidents or by abusing prescription medication. But neither cars nor pain medication have been banned in the USA. However, a number of successful initiatives have been adopted to improve road safety and clamp down on the overprescription of opiates. As with car travel and pain medication, gun ownership comes with risks and benefits. The question is whether the current policies pose an unacceptable level of risk to the public or are too strict for firearm owners to enjoy the benefits, and whether any policy will satisfactorily bring these risks and benefits into balance. So this was the gist of the gun debate. I covered as much ground as I thought was necessary to form an opinion, being as neutral as I possibly could. I invite you to a civil discussion in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.